Alright, class, welcome back. So we're talking about realism. Realism as opposed maybe to idealism and romanticism in one way. What is realism? It's important that you understand that there are two versions or views of realism, as we have stated earlier. There is a traditional view of realism and structuralist view of realism in the 20th century. The traditional view of realism signifies a relationship between a text and reality. That is felt to be immediate and direct. So realism in the sense that the text, the novel, the text depicts reality in a direct and immediate manner. And so realism in this sense, traditional realism is realistic. The adjective would be realistic, not realist. Realism in the traditional sense or view is nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment or representation of material, the material, reality, the material world. Representing it, trying to represent reality as it is, without idealization, without romanticization, representing corruption, representing the dark side of life as it is, without idealizing it or, as I said, romanticizing it. This is the traditional view of realism. And so, a novel that uses, realism in this sense is realistic. Realistic. Now, this was before the 20th century. The view of realism in the 18th and 19th or in the 19th century. Realism, as has come to be understood in the 20th century, under the influence of structuralist literary critics and theorists, such as Roland Barthes, the French critic, and others. Realism, from the structuralist view, does not mean realistic, or the realism of a novel or a work of art does not coming from the truthful treatment or representation or the relationship between the text and reality. Rather, idealism here refers to the techniques or devices used to create what Barthes calls a reality effect. And so realism, as viewed by structuralists, has to do with the adoption of techniques or devices or formal characteristics for reproducing a sense of the real. So it refers then to the devices used. It is the devices, the conventions used that can make a text realist. rather than the mimesis or representation of events. The adoption of certain conventions that are associated with non-fictional texts that make a text realist. So again, the structuralist view of realism says that a text can be realist by way of adopting formal conventions or characteristics of realism which are similar to those used in non-fictional texts. By adopting the conventions, using the conventions that are used in producing non-fictional texts. And so realism stems from the application of certain conventions rather than the representation of reality. Let's look at some of these conventions used to make a text realist from the structuralist perspective. The techniques, the devices. So let's look at some conventions of the realist narrative or novel. Can you please refer to page 291? Here are some markers of realism, some conventions of the realist texts, The subject matter is generally drawn from everyday, ordinary life. So one convention, these are conventions. Once used or applied, then the text will be realist. So the subject matter is generally drawn from everyday, ordinary life. In this sense, guys, a realist text can be talking about science fiction or fantasy and be realist, as long as the text uses conventions associated with non-fictional text. Even a science fiction novel can be realist. And so we should, as I said, distinguish between traditional realism, which bases realism on the relationship between text and reality as being felt directly and immediately. Realism as being nothing more, nothing less than the truthful treatment or representation or mimesis or imitation of reality. That's the traditional view. Structuralist view sees realism differently. It has to do with the conventions, as I said, rather than the truthful representation of reality. And so it is possible, therefore, to make a distinction between realistic, commonly used to mean something like close to how I see reality or lifelike, and realist. In the more technical sense of conforming to conventions for passing something off as real, so that even future fantasy or science fiction could be seen as a drawing on conventions of realism, stylistically or formally. Realistic is an evaluation of a piece of a prose, whereas realist is an assessment of the formal elements of a prose narrative. So to know if a text is realist, you need to see if the conventions used for realist texts are used, which are similar to the ones used in non-fictional texts. So this is what makes a text a realist. Let's look at the other characteristics or conventions used to make a text realist. even if it's, as I said, about science fiction. The characters are ordinary people presented as complex individuals who are shown to be capable of a change and development. So, characters presented as complex individuals who are shown to be capable of a change and development, going through marriage, death, going through divorce, success, schooling, education, problems. There is a moral position from which the events are viewed. So this is also a convention that there is a moral position from which the events are viewed. There is a consistent point of view from which the events are evaluated. There may be more than one, but they are consistent. The narrator represents a non-contradictory reality. The narrator does not draw attention to him or herself. The language used in the narrative does not draw attention to itself. Non-reflexive. Events are arranged in roughly chronological order. There may be flashbacks, but the sequence of events is clear. The narrative reaches a clear resolution. The closure, there is a closure, a resolution. There is detailed description of material objects through descriptive passages. Detailed descriptive passages describing clothes, faces, furniture, etc., etc. There are realist operators, a term used by Barthes to mean the inclusion of arbitrary details. Arbitrary details. There is an example on page 288 of what Barthes terms as realist operators. In the example on page 288, not very far from Upton 7, between it, in fact, and the Malvern Hills stands the country seat of the Gordons of Bramley, well timbered, well cottaged, well fenced, and well watered, blah blah blah. Now the aside, the parenthetical statement, the aside in the first sentence, between it, in fact, and the Malvern Hills, this aside, this parenthetical sentence serves no discernible informational purpose as such. It is not meant to give information. The purpose of this is to function simply to give a sense of the real. Between it, in fact, and the Malvern Hills, to give a sense of the real, verisimilitude, to render some verisimilitude, to give the appearance of the real, reality. This is an example of what Barthes terms as realist operators. So the inclusion of arbitrary details. On page 292, the last of the conventions, the narrative includes an appeal to the cultural code. Again, a term used by the structuralist Barthes, views that we are all supposed to share. So a realist text draws on the cultural code, on things, stereotypes, and things that we all take for granted, that we all share, supposed knowledge, presupposition of knowledge, drawing on things within one's culture that every member of the discourse community or the language community understands and shares and agrees with. Can you please look at page 286. So when a writer decides to produce a realist novel, there is already a set of conventions in place governing the choices to be made. Further examples of the conventions: he or she, a writer who wishes to produce a realist text, will be constrained by a number of conventions that govern the production of such a narrative. For example, events in the text are arranged in a roughly chronological order, as we have said. There are complex, rounded, developed characters who develop throughout the narrative. There is generally a narrator who will constitute a consistent position within the text. There will be an ending that will draw the various strands and subplots in the narrative together, creating a denouement, resolution, the closure. And events will be included on the basis of a clear relevance to plot development. Point of view is also particularly important in the realist texts, as we shall see. The presence of a reliable or omniscient narrator, someone who has a God's eye view, creates a hierarchy of discourse that seems to guarantee that at least one view of the events in the novel offers us a view of the truth or the real, because he is presented or she is presented as knowing everything with unrestricted knowledge, as we said in the morning session when we talked about the point of view. Unrestricted knowledge about everything. Although these conventions of realism can be experimented with and altered, as they invariably are in novels, they nevertheless exist as the basis for the construction of realist texts. And so, guys, now I think it's clear that there are two views of realism. The past, or the traditional one, is that the text, for a text to be, or realism meant the truthful representation of the materials or reality in literature or a work of art. The other view has to do with the conventions or devices or techniques used in non-fictional texts. Applying these conventions can make a text realist, regardless of whether it's a science fiction or a future fantasy or etc., etc. And so David Lodge defines then, or suggests, a working definition of realism in literature as the representation of experience in a manner which approximates closely to descriptions of similar experience in non-literary texts of the same culture. Again, traditional realism is nothing more, nothing less than the truthful representation of the materials. Structuralist realism is the representation of experience in a manner which approximates closely to descriptions of similar experience in non-literary texts of the same culture. So when you read a non-literary text, you find the same way of describing events, the same conventions. So as we have seen, for example, when David Lodge, for example, compared a literary text and a non-literary text about capital punishment when he compared a realist text, literary realist text, and a non-literary text, a newspaper, talking about capital punishment. He found that the language used in both genres, the conventions used are the same. And so using conventions used in non-literary texts or non-fictional texts can produce a reality effect, can produce a realist text. So this is realism in the 20th, as understood in the 20th century. It is made possible by the application of certain conventions. And so if these conventions are not used, then the text will not be considered as realist. And there are examples in the book about realist texts and non-realist texts. There are examples of both. If you want me to mention these examples, we can. Again, you look at page 288 for an example of a realist text. Let's look at this text on page 288. Okay, not very far from Upton 7, between it, in fact, and the Melvin Hills, stands the country seat of the Gordons of Bramley, well timbered, well cottaged, well fenced, and well watered, having in this latter respect a stream that forks in exactly the right position to feed two large lakes in the grounds. The house itself is of Georgian red brick, with charming circular windows near the roof. It has dignity and pride without ostentation, self-assurance without arrogance, repose without inertia, and the gentle aloofness that to those who know its spirit but adds to its value at home. This is what we call a descriptive passage. And one convention, as we have mentioned, one convention or characteristic, formal characteristic of realist texts is the use of descriptive passages. Away from dialogues, you find long descriptive passages. So this is a convention that governs the production of realist narrative, in addition to the conventions that we have mentioned. Such descriptive details, give a realist or impression, or the description of the house, for example, here as being built of Georgian red brick and as having circular windows seems excessive. These elements of the passage may thus be seen to function as what Barthes terms, as we have said, realist operators. The inclusion of these arbitrary details, producing a reality effect. That is, they signal to the reader that this is a realist text, and helping to reinforce for the reader a sense that the text is well anchored to some recognizable reality. Georgian red brick, with charming circular windows near the roof. A further convention, before we look at the example of non-realist text, a further convention in realist texts is, as we have said, the closure or the resolution. Usually the moral dilemma is being resolved, rather than left unresolved. Usually it is resolved. So let's look now at an example of a non-realist. But before that, look at the other text that is realist on page 288. The molten hall came to Molten Hall came the Lady Anna Gordon as a bride of just over 20. She was lovely as only an Irish woman can be, having that in her bearing that betokened the quiet pride, having that in her eyes that betokened great longing, having that in her body that betokened happy promise. The archetype of the very perfect woman whom creating God has found good. So this rich description of Anna is presented as if the reader will instantly recognize that it fits the stereotype of the perfect woman. And so the writer here is drawing on the cultural code, the shared knowledge, assuming that the reader will agree with him that these qualities are characteristic of the Irish woman. So it is presented as information that we all know. In this way, in drawing on this kind of background knowledge, we are drawing upon the cultural code, using the term to indicate an organized repository of common sense knowledge and stereotypes. It is through the cultural code that realist texts confirm certain conventional views of reality, drawing on the cultural code. Malays being maybe lazy, Chinese being hardworking. So drawing on the cultural code, stereotypes, whether they are true or untrue, stereotypes. In this way, realist texts are creating rather than reflecting realities. They create reality rather than just reflect reality. And so realist texts do not merely reflect or describe reality, but rather they create and reinforce reality. And one way of reading realist texts is to see them as shaping rather than reflecting our views of the real. Shaping our views of the real, not just reflecting. And so this draws our attention to the relationship between language and power. We highlighted in a previous class. Language as constructing a reality, shaping reality, a reality, shaping our social relationships, interpersonal relationships, and also creating a reality. So realist texts do not just reflect or describe reality, they rather recreate and reinforce reality or a certain reality. Let's look at an example of a non-realist text. Look at page 290. Then the police arrived. I like the police. They have uniforms and numbers, and you know what they are meant to be doing. There was a policewoman and a policeman. The policewoman had a little hole in her tights on her left ankle and a red scratch in the middle of the hole. The policeman had a big orange leaf stuck in to the bottom of his shoe, which was poking out from one side. The policewoman put her arms around Mrs. Shears and led her back towards the house. I lifted my head off the grass. The policeman squatted down beside me and said, "Would you like to tell me what's going on here, young man?" I sat up and said, "The dog is dead." "I'd got that far," he said. I said, "I think someone killed the dog. How old are you?" he asked. I replied, "I am 15 years and 3 months and 2 days. And what precisely were you doing in the garden? He asked. I was holding the dog, I replied. And why were you holding the dog? He asked. This was a difficult question. It was something I wanted to do. I like dogs. It made me sad to see that the dog was dead. I like policemen too, and I wanted to answer the question properly, but the policeman did not give me enough time to work out the correct answer. This extract is not a conventionally realist text, although it shares certain of the features of realism. For example, the dialogue, the description. There is a certain amount of descriptive information given about the characters, and yet this information seems not to be the type of relevant character revealing information that we find in realist texts. Instead, the reader is presented with information about the police officers that appears random, that the policewoman has a hole in her tights, for example, socks, and that there is a scratch on her leg, that the policeman has a leaf stuck to his shoe. This type of information seems to conform to Barthes' reality effect in that it is excessive, non-necessary information. But here its relevance to the plot or character development is in question. In a similar way, we are not informed that the character narrator is lying on the ground, but rather we are forced to work this out when he says, I lifted my head off the grass. We expect realist narratives to spell out what is happening clearly to the reader, leaving nothing probably to the imagination of the reader. The fact that the protagonist gives the police officers either too much information, like when he talked about his age, 15 years, 3 months and 2 days, for example, or too little about his reasons for being in the garden. This way leads the reader to surmise, to think that this is not the trustworthy narrator of the classic realism. We are forced to assume that this narrator's perspective is just one of many different views of the events, and thus the hierarchy of discourses of classic realism is reversed. Instead of the narrator presenting us with the truth of the events, here his perspective needs to be set alongside the perspective of the police officers. We know that in realist texts, we've said that one convention is that the narrator is omniscient. He gives you, at least, you get a feeling that he knows everything, and so he gives you a sense of the real. So in this text we do not feel this kind of hierarchy of discourses, someone knowing everything. The narrator in the text we have just read does not seem to know everything, does not provide information as we would expect in a realist text. Thus, contemporary texts may be non-realist in the sense that they play with the conventions of a classic realism, or they may be attempting to represent different realities, calling for different forms of representation. This should be enough about realism. So I'll end the discussion about realism now. Traditional view of realism, realistic, the signification of relation between reality and the text, truthful representation of reality, and the structuralist view of realism, which has to do more with the conventions and characteristics of the text, which are similar to those in non-fictional texts. All right, so that's all about this topic. Any questions? All right, so let me end this discussion now. Thank you.